Okay, today we're talking about how should a company consider a decision whether to do a project in-house or to outsource that project to a specialized agency. It's a question that you have to answer for yourself. And we have 11 questions that you must ask before you take on this project. My guest today is my business partner, Dr. Jeremy Weiss. I'll tell you more about him in a second, so stay tuned.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the same. And right now, I feel like $100,000.
You are listening to Inspired Insider with your host, Dr. Jeremy Weiss.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here. I'm the host of this show. And you know, every week, if you've listened before, I've got smart CEOs, founders, and entrepreneurs from all kinds of companies. We've had Netflix, Kinko's, YPO, EO, Activation Blizzard, Lending Tree, Gusto, OpenTable, lots of great episodes. Check out the archives and you can check out more of those. And of course, this episode brought to you by our company, Rise25, where we help B2B businesses to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. And you can learn more about what we do at rise25.com or email us at support@rise25.com. And all right, we got my business partner, Dr. Jeremy Weiss, here today, and we are going to be diving into the topic of when should a company consider taking a project in-house versus outsourcing that project to a specialized agency. And we're going to be talking about it in the context of what we do, which is helping B2B companies to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. And so, Jeremy, let's just kick it off here. What are a couple of considerations? How do you want to frame this episode?
Yeah, so we'll go through some of the questions that we have found to come up with the right decision, and then we'll go in a little detail. But I just do want to frame this whole conversation, why this is important, because you know, for us or any company, when you're thinking of investing resources, that means time and energy resources of yourself and your team. It means money. So this is it could be a big decision whether to keep the project in-house or to outsource it to a specialized agency. So it comes up, I know, John, I mean, for us as a company and all the companies we talk to, this is going through their head where they realize it or whether we realize it or not, right? So here's some of the questions. We'll just go through some of the questions and we'll discuss them a little bit further. But we did a lot of research online from what other companies ask, what we ask. And so here's some of the deciding questions that we think about. One, what's the core competency of our business, right? Is it related closely to our services, or is it outside our primary focus? The second question is, what's the skill level and expertise required for that task? The third one is the expected volume of work of that project. The fourth is, what's the cost comparison, right? And it's not just cost, just the actual money cost, but there is opportunity cost as well. 5 is, what's the timeline for the project? The 6 is, what's the impact on the internal resources? The 7th is, what's the level of control and customization required for it? 8, what are the risks associated with each option? 9 is, what's the strategic importance of the task, right? How's it going to affect the business and bring in an expert or not? And 10 is, what's the potential for long-term relationships? John, people often miss this one. Someone I just talked to, they didn't, I don't think, realize, like, at least with us, how many relationships we bring to the table for them outside of just everything else. And I look at the same with partners and relationships too. And that's a factor that we evaluate. Then 11 is, what's your client lifetime value, right? And that factors in. Why don't we start with 1, what's the core competency of our business?
And I think that there's different ways of defining that. We were just talking about, like a chip maker, like an Intel, they can look at, like, are we a tech company? Are we a chip maker? Are we a chip maker who makes a certain type of chip for a certain type of product? There's different ways that companies can define that. Companies sometimes that evolves and changes what your core competency is. What it was 5 years ago might be completely different from what it is now.
Yeah, I mean, so is the job closely related to your core competency? If it's not, you're going to be, there's a learning curve there.
Yeah.
And the second is, do you want to focus on your expertise in company and your superpower, or split your time and attention? So when we're thinking of the core competency, that's really a key component to that. Like we try and stick to our core competency when we're bringing an outside vendor in. And that's a major question we ask. Okay.
Yeah.
Number 2, the skill level and expertise required for the task.
Yeah.
Talk about that. And we've seen a bunch of mistakes with that.
And you see this all the time, right? Sometimes you look at something from the outside and you think like, oh, we've got the expertise for this. And then you get into it and you realize there's a lot more to it than would be, involved. I'll give you an example. I've been looking at replacing a HVAC system on our house. And getting into it and like realizing, wow, this is really over my head. You start watching some YouTube videos and you think I could handle this myself, and then pretty soon you realize
I would never think I could handle this. By the way, changing a light bulb, I can.
Maybe
handle.
I'm a little too
maybe
I'm a little too over ambitious. But you go down the YouTube rabbit hole.
No.
You go down the YouTube rabbit hole, and you're like, oh, I could do this, But then you realize, oh, okay, this is actually quite specialized. There's a lot of knowledge that's required here.
I mean, look at it in an agency perspective. Like we know a lot of agencies, and there's ones that only specialize, let's say, in email marketing, right? For e-commerce businesses.
Yeah, very
specialized. In an
specialized.
e-commerce business, they could be like, you know what? I can send an email out. But when talking to, we've run a lot of podcasts for agencies in the e-commerce business realm, and it's like, oh wait, do you have a abandoned cart sequence? Do you have this sequence? Do you have that sequence? There's like 11 different sequences that they've built out that can make them more money. So at first glance, like you said, it looks like, oh yeah, I could send an email out through Klaviyo on Shopify or something, but there's a lot more that goes into it. So what is the skill and expertise?
So that's one where it's easy to underestimate the amount of skill and expertise that could be required. And the next one is what's the expected volume of the work, which is another one where people oftentimes underestimate the amount of work that would be required. Specifically, if we're talking about the context of a podcast, it can be a lot of work, especially if you're not used to doing this type of work on a regular basis. There's context switching from doing the work that you normally do to switching to the other, type of work. And frankly, my podcast for the first 3 or 4 years, that was the reason that I was very inconsistent with it, was because I was trying to oversee that stuff myself. It was a lot more work than I expected and not something that I should have been handling myself.
I think we were even talking on the podcast realm, talking to someone who was doing it themselves, and they kind of said leisurely, yeah, maybe we spend like, I don't know, the team spends 30 hours per episode. And you were like, wait,
crazy.
What?
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
And it's not sustainable. Like when I hear that, I say, look, you're not going to be doing this 6 months from now. They think they are. They think, oh, it'll be fine, but it's just going to grind to a halt. You're not going to keep on doing it if that's the case. I had one person that told me once that they spent 100 hours of their own time on their very first episode. And guess what? They had exactly one episode that was live. It was a couple of years earlier. They'd gone live on this one episode, and then it was such a negative experience. They never put any more effort into coming up with an episode 2.
I'll give those people credit for at least tracking it, because some people don't even track it and don't realize how much they are spending and how much their team is spending in there. But it goes into the volume of work. Is it a one-time project? Is it a recurring need? And how does that volume affect your decision? Obviously, if in our world, if you're doing a podcast, you want to keep doing it because it builds relationships and with partners, clients, and everyone else. So
next consideration is, what is the cost comparison? So the cost between, doing it in-house versus the cost of outsourcing. And for this, Jeremy, what are a couple of thoughts on this one?
Yeah, from a cost comparison, I always factor in opportunity costs, like even for ourselves. If we're thinking of doing something and bringing in another agency to help us, we have lots of agencies that help us. Same thing with companies we're talking to. So there's a big opportunity cost, right? And so I was talking to someone actually earlier today, and it's like, maybe, quote unquote, maybe they save a bit of money with their internal team doing it. But obviously some of those other things, like the expertise is not there. Like obviously we're specialized in what we do. And if you're talking to an agency, they're specialized. So the expertise isn't there. So not only is it's somewhat comparable. It wasn't like when I was talking to them, it actually wasn't that much more for us to just take everything off their team's plate and deliver a higher quality service and focusing on the strategy and ROI. It seemed like a no-brainer. And the cost comparison is also an opportunity cost, right?
Yeah.
Which is now you're spending time on something else instead of serving your current clients. And again, it goes back to the core competency. If this is not your core competency, then the cost is going to be higher in general because your team's going to spend more time and energy on something that should take a shorter amount of time, regardless.
Right. So even if that's a quote unquote fixed cost because it's a full-time employee, it's costing you more because they're spending more of their time on that rather than they could be spending time on other things.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next one, which is number 5. What is the timeline for the project? Is this something that you don't care when it gets done? Is it something that you want to get done in Q1, Q2?
You were talking to someone recently that said, "Oh yeah, we'll get it out," and then 6 months later.
Exactly. It happens all the time, and oftentimes the first question I ask people is like, how long have you been thinking about doing this thing? Right. And it's oftentimes 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, they've been thinking about doing it. And the reason that it doesn't come to fruition is simply because they leave it in that area or they don't bring in those outside expertise that can get it done, so quickly. We were just talking to a team member who mentioned that they had their bathroom redone in 4 days. And I was like, 4 days? Oh my gosh, that's crazy, And a lot of times, you might be thinking about something like that, but it could be done in 4 days. If you want something to be done quickly, it can get done quickly, but you have to bring in outside specialists in order to do that.
In that particular case, this person has a very high client lifetime value. Like we're talking, millions of dollars, and they lost at least 6 months already that they could have gotten a client, maybe 2. Mm-hmm. So that could mean millions of dollars for this business just because they've been thinking about it and haven't done anything, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that's why we're talking about this question, right? And the criteria.
Yeah. You're pushing it off, and so that's definitely a consideration. Number 6, what is the impact on internal resources? Now, this is one that I really like because I think a lot of times owners, CEOs of businesses don't realize the impact on their team, and it can lead to attrition. It can lead to team members leaving if they're torn between different projects. A lot of times they like working on the work that they were hired to do, and if they are forced to divert their resources, their attention between different projects, then that really can drain morale. It can cause them to feel like unfocused. There's a lot of things that can have a big impact on those. Your biggest asset, which is your team.
Yeah, and I feel like there's kind of 2 scenarios here. One scenario is the team is just doing their work and they have a normal workload, right? And you throw this on top of their normal workload and it really affects their job. Right. And we're cognizant of that with our team. Like, hey, can you do this? And it's like, oh, it's one more thing I have to do. And the other scenario we find is maybe they don't have as much work right now. For the the team member maybe has a lighter load right now. And we've seen it happen where, well, then all of a sudden it gets busy.
Right.
And that project is no longer the priority.
Right. And in the podcast context, when your podcast is your business development, it's your networking, it's your lead generation, it's your SEO, it's your content marketing. It's when it's serving all these different purposes. And then you get busy because you have to onboard some new clients. And then the team members stop doing it, and you look up and it's been 6 months and you haven't put out a podcast episode, and all of a sudden leads are not flowing in and new clients are not coming around. Well, what happened? What happened is that it was an impact on internal resources that were split between different priorities. And so it got dropped by the wayside. And then that affects all those different things that we mentioned. It affects your business development, it affects your pipeline, it affects your leads, all that kind of stuff. And so it has a big impact. That's number
just
6.
Talk really quickly about the timeline piece, because the fast track, I think about this a lot. Like, do you want a proven fast track and a proven plan and fast track things, or do you prefer to learn and figure out yourself? For me, obviously from a podcast perspective, we talked about that person could have had their podcast going like 4 months ago, right? For me in my health journey, like, can I get healthy and like know enough to figure things out myself? Sometimes I'm just like, listen, I just need to hire someone who has the exact plan and just put me on it, and I'll just get there a lot quicker with a proven plan.
That's a perfect example, because you're someone who knows more in your little pinky finger than most people that I know about health, about what's good for you. And yet when you got serious about getting fit, you hired a personal trainer. You hired a personal trainer to hold you accountable to actually do the things that you knew you wanted to do. And it's been really transformative for you.
And they have specialized knowledge.
Big transformation.
Like, could I go on YouTube and watch a bunch of videos? And I've studied stuff for 15 years, but they have specialized knowledge in this realm that is not my specialty.
Yeah, it could be something like, oh, you're lifting that weight in the wrong way and you're going to injure yourself, and you'll be out of commission for 2 months, and then boom, there goes the entire routine. Yeah.
So
that's a great point.
A level of control. So the 7th one, so after, what's the impact on internal resources? The 7th one is, what's the level of control and customization required? Talk about that.
Yeah.
With control.
I think with that, it really has to do with, how are you at delegating to a specialist? Is this something that you need to have control over? Are you like that throughout the business, where you need to have your fingerprints on every different thing that's going on? Or are you able to delegate? Are you able to let someone, can you provide the guideline? And of course your vision is throughout, but that it's going to get across the finish line, even if you're not watching every different piece of it. So those are some considerations, like how much control do you need to assert upon it? Or can you trust? Can you delegate?
And that's, I find like a muscle that I have to use or people have to use to get okay with it. Yeah. 8, what are the risks associated with each option, right? So we're talking, versus in-house versus outsourcing, reliability, which kind of goes back into the, some of these kind of overlap, right? Because if your team is overworked or they get busy, it's not that the team member is not reliable. It's just like they have other priorities that take precedence over this, right? And so,
or even different skill sets, right? They might like editing video and do it in their spare time, but that doesn't mean that they're going to produce show notes that are up to a caliber that you're going to be proud of representing your company.
Yeah. So what's, the quality and reliability risks as an option, right? I mean, I was talking to a really high level executive at a publicly traded company. Okay. And they're doing consulting, and we get on the call, and they were interested in doing a podcast, but that's not what we were referring to. He's like, look, I created this website for my consulting business. And I'm thinking, why would can you create a website for, yes, you can go on like Wix and like do it. But like, is this representing you from the quality standpoint? And I was nice about it, but I was just like, listen, there's professionals that they could just craft you like an amazing website. It doesn't have to be crazy expensive either, but so it's a risk. People check out what you just DIY'd, and be like, oh, this is not for me. Like this
They'd have a
person's
bunch
not
of
for me.
flash and blinky icons and a little counter at the bottom and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. It
So
doesn't
there's
really help with the
risks.
reputation.
There's risk involved.
Yes. Number 9.
What's the strategic importance of the task? So number 9, what's the strategic importance of the task?
Yeah, that's a great question.
So,
How
is this
important?
task really that important, right? I mean, maybe you just don't do it at all. Like in our case, obviously, like you said, there's so many benefits from like a podcast perspective. Like there's a lot of strategy that goes in. Is it going to require a hands-on approach to execute all these things, right?
Right. Which parts of the approach require the hands-on component to it? In the podcast context, a lot of our discussions that we have with clients are what should you be spending time on and what should you not be spending time on? And I've seen people, that start doing podcasts and they spend all this time on things that don't matter, like they're spending the time adjusting the font size on the website. Like you are far too important to be spending time on that, or maybe they enjoy creating little video snippets. And so they do that in their free time, but a client is worth $2 million. Should you be spending an hour, 2 hours on the weekend doing that? If you enjoy it, it's a hobby. That's fine. But should you be spending your time on that when having another conversation could lead to another $2 million client? That's a much better use of your time, and that's really gets to kind of that strategic importance of what you should be spending your time on, the most strategically important uses of your time.
Number 10 is, what is the potential for long-term relationships? So, could outsourcing this help build relationships with external partners, and they have a bunch of relationships in that industry that might be really valuable in the long run?
Yeah. We've done that before where we've hired people, vendors, we've hired companies. We paid them because we want to develop a relationship with them and their network beyond the service that they provide.
100%. And number 11 is, what's your client lifetime value, right?
Yeah.
Because if, maybe it's not that big and there needs to be something in there for it to make sense for a company to, hire partners for it.
Yeah.
So these are some of the questions. I like to talk, and we'll talk about, some of the reasons we found why companies, DIY it or handle it in-house. But I remember one of that podcast episodes I did, that was the most resounding example of this in-house versus outsource, was Mobileye, right? Mobileye, I had the founding engineer on, and Mobileye is a chip company that helps fuel an autonomous vehicle, self-driving car, essentially. And Intel, what they realized was they had all of the chips in some of these self-driving cars, and Mobileye had one chip in the car. And Intel was like, wait, why do we not have all the chips? Like literally, what's this one chip? Like, why don't we just figure out how to create this one chip so we have all of the chips in the car that run the car? And so they evaluated and talked to Mobileye. So they had to make a decision. Do we create a whole team around in this expertise of creating this one chip? Or do we outsource and buy Mobileye as a company? Okay. I'll have to fact check this, but I believe Intel bought Mobileye for $15.2 billion. Maybe it was 15.3. Listen, a 0.1 decimal place, John, is 100 million. So I don't want to get that wrong, but let's just pretend for argument's sake, it's $15.2 billion. That means Intel thought it was cheaper, more effective to buy the company for $15.2 billion then to create a separate division and team and everything, like let's say they go, oh, we're going to invest 10 billion. That'd still be 5 billion less than paying for Mobileye. But they found it, you mentioned this before we hit record about they had a head start.
Yeah, they probably time. Some of the other factors we just talked about, the questions we just talked about, were probably weighed into that. Mobileye had been doing it for 10 years longer than Intel had, so it probably would have taken Intel 5, 6, 7 years to catch up. All the
mistakes that Mobileye had figured out in those 10 years, and they shortcutted it, they fast tracked it, and bought them.
It was strategically important, right? This wasn't like this wasn't like a side mirror in the car. This was a key component of the car and will be a key component of the cars going forward in the future. So it's strategically important to them. So yeah.
So a lot of these questions, like we take it through this example, Mobileye probably had long-term relationships that they built with different car manufacturers now that Intel has. So, take those questions through any decision as far as that goes. So let's talk about the reasons we have found why companies DIY or handle in-house. One of the main ones is cost, right? Talk about that and on the surface, how are people evaluating cost?
I mean, on the surface, oftentimes they think that it may be saving you money to take it in-house, especially if you're using, as we mentioned earlier, a fixed resource, someone who's already being paid. But the truth is, if they're working on this project, they can't work on this other project. They're torn between different projects. There's hard costs involved in that person's time. If they take longer to complete that project, then it's going to it actually ends up can cost you more, right? So that's definitely a consideration. An analogy would be like, coast to coast travel. Like if I want to go, I live in San Francisco. If I want to go to New York City, I could drive myself across country, and that would probably be less expensive. Or I can hop on a plane. The ticket's going to cost me something more, I'll still get from A to B. I'll get from coast to coast. There's two different ways of achieving that, but the cost, will be significant. I'll be stuck in driving myself across country for a week. That's a significant cost to me. And I got to pay for gas, and there's wear and tear in the car and all that kind of stuff. So there's other considerations that go into cost.
The next one is a team member. We hear this a lot. Hey, I have a team member. They have a lot of free time. They've also maybe expressed interest in, doing some of these tasks. How do we think about that?
Yeah, and that has happened more frequently as our world, podcasting, has become more popular, and people are interested in listening to podcasts and stuff like that. Oh, I like listening to podcasts. I'd like to be involved in this project. There's a couple of considerations that you should think about is, if even if a team member says they want to step up, they want to manage that process, you're going to have to manage that person and probably other people too that don't have that expertise. This is what happened to me my first 4 or 5 years doing the podcast. I didn't even realize it if you'd asked me at the time, but I was basically project managing it, and I was doing a crappy job of that. And then it was when Jeremy and I had started a business together, and I was like, Jeremy, I see you putting out 2 episodes per week of your podcast. You've been doing this for years and years. I'm totally inconsistent with mine. What am I doing wrong? And he pointed all that out to me, that I needed to manage people. I had no real good defined process for it. And we totally revamped it, and it became far more effective for me. Another consideration is that team member could leave. They probably will at some point leave. And if all that knowledge is baked in that one person, we've seen this happen over and over again. Podcast just grinds to a halt. We talk to people all the time that, we look at like, they come to us and they're like, I had a podcast. It's, and we look at it, and the last one they published was 2 years ago. And it's like, well, what happened? And we're like, I had this team member who was working on it, and they left, and nothing was documented. There was no SOPs, and boom, leads drive to a halt. Boom, business development grinds to a halt. These things end when that one team member leaves. And then I think I touched on it a second ago, but that person may not have all the expertise that you need, even if they're interested in it, that doesn't mean they have all the expertise.
Yep. Another reason we have found companies do it is they don't want to delegate. They need to control different pieces of the process, all the pieces of the process, and they really kind of micromanage the process, and they want control. Again, if it's someone's core competency, I totally get it, right? It's like, that's what they do. But outside of the core competency, it needs to be delegated, right? To get done, right?
Yeah.
And so that is a key factor. Someone's like, I need it a specific way every time, which again, like for any agency you're working with, they can follow your guidelines and take what you need and execute on it. But, let them do what they do best, because they're the expert, right? When I go into the coach for health, I'm like, hey, just tell me what to do. Like, I'll just listen to what you're the expert. Tell me what I need to do. And I try and be as coachable as possible with the process. So, and the fourth one is, we've had people come to us and they've done the podcast before in the past, or they're doing it currently, and they said, "Oh, I'm not getting ROI. I tried it already and it doesn't really work." And that could be for Facebook ads agency. That could be for email. I tried doing this, it didn't work. And what do we talk about with those cases?
I mean, in many cases, there could be a lot of different failure points, and we oftentimes think that we're the best at diagnosing where we went wrong or where we went awry. But oftentimes we need the perspective and an outside expert to come in and see what we did wrong. In terms of the podcast, we've done other episodes where we talked about the million different things that people could be doing wrong. It could be a lack of consistency on reaching out, following up with prospective guests. It could be not having a structure for doing the actual interview. It could be the questions that you ask. It could be the strategy of the types of guests you have on. We've seen lots of people that interview, B-level celebrities, rather than interviewing their, best client who they've had for 10 years and who has referred tons of clients to them. You should interview that person. So a lot of times we see people making those sorts of mistakes, or not reading a sponsor message or describing what they do.
Have
I've been
the
a guest
right strategy. Like, there's so many strategies that they're not deploying, that there's so many failure points, right? And so that goes into having someone who's an expert, a team that's an expert to help. The best example I love with this is, we did an event, and someone in the room, someone suggested, "Oh, you should try Facebook ads," right? And that person said, "Yeah, we tried that, didn't work." And then someone else in the room was a Facebook ad agency that drove tens of millions of dollars to their clients every month. And it's just sort of funny. And they were speaking up and like, "Hey, I think you should try this." And we kind of interrupted and said, "Hey, just so you know, like, you say it doesn't work. She drives tens of millions of dollars every month. So maybe it's your process that doesn't work. It's not Facebook ads that doesn't work." So, is an example. So those are some of the, go ahead.
Yeah. And, we carry these biases throughout our lives. When you talk about getting fit, getting healthy, losing weight, people try different diets. They don't work.
It doesn't work. Right.
And then some new health regime comes along that might work for them, but they don't want to try it because we have this baggage in our head about the time that it didn't work, or the multiple times that it didn't work for us previously. So those are all.
The last one is really, someone who comes to us in their, or your agency, and they basically express that they've got it all figured out. So they don't see the value in the expertise and strategy, and they feel like, "Okay, I can figure this out myself, and I don't need you," right? So it's more of like a mentality perspective. The last thing we'll talk about is, like, so when you're thinking of evaluating an agency, an external partner agency, what are the things you should look for in evaluating that company?
Yeah. And, one is, how much experience do they have in this specific field? Not every different thing under the sun, but this specific, field. For us in the B2B podcasting context, combined 30 plus years of experience working in this area. The next one is strategic advice should really be underlie everything that you do. And it should really come first, especially in the B2B podcasting world. You need to have the right strategy, or you can do everything else flawlessly. If the strategy is wrong, you will not be doing it for very long. You will end up very frustrated.
That goes with any agency. Like, we focus on making sure it makes sense for the business and the strategy. And the same thing goes, say, oh, I just want a website. Well, you want it actually driving leads to your business. I just want a podcast. Well, you want it driving partnerships and revenue for your business, right? So focusing on the strategy first is an agency that thinks of your goals is really important. Number 3, external accountability.
So important. And I think we don't even realize how important it is. Again, going back to your, fitness journey, having a health coach to help hold you accountable in spite of everything that you already knew about healthy habits. It's really critical because, in the B2B podcasting world, it's not like you build a website and you're done. A podcast is a journey. It's something that you need to do over time. It's not something that you do once and you're done. And so you really need to have someone who's going to have the outside stature to hold you accountable. And it can't be a internal team member that works for you, that reports to you, because they're just not going to hold you accountable in the way that someone outside of your organization will.
Yeah. And that's why we're so part of what we talk about and do with clients is people get assigned that personal trainer for their business development, which is their outreach strategist.
Yeah.
The 4th is provide the execution to ease the burden of your team. So an agency that's actually going to save you and your company tons of time by executing on these things. You don't have to. And then the 5th one provides you with a streamlined, deliberate process.
Yeah. And here's where you can see whether someone's thought through these pieces or not. And, Jeremy, we and our team have collectively put in our proverbial 10,000 hours into this process. And we have very defined thoughts and ideas about how these things should be done because we know what works and we know what doesn't. And so we even built software. We built a tool to go with it, our podcast Copilot, that puts all of that into play and into practice.
This is one of my favorite ones. It's the last one. What you should look for, an external partner agency is actually practicing the craft, right? So in our world, let's say you hire a company to help you with their podcast and they don't have a podcast or they don't release a regular podcast.
Yeah.
It's like me hiring a super overweight trainer.
Okay.
Which I'm sure there's good trainers, but like if they practice what they preach, then I want someone who has a proper diet, they're working out a lot, and I want to strive to be like them. Right. And so, same thing with if you hire a website design company and you look at their website and it's horrendous, then I get it. It's like, what's the saying with the cobbler's kids or whatever?
Cobbler's kids, yeah.
Don't have shoes, but still, like, it's kind of funny. Like, okay, you do this, but you're not practicing it. Like, obviously, doing 2 episodes a week for over like 15 years, right? And so we eat our own dog food. So to speak.
So just kind of to wrap up this episode, I think that obviously having done the work that we do for so long, we have strong thoughts on how to see success and what leads to disappointing results. But that comes with time. It comes with expertise. It comes with having done it for as long as we have. Any final thoughts on that, Jeremy?
No, I think we kind of laid out the questions, and we use these questions internally when we make decisions in general, and we don't want to overburden our team the same way we advise people not overburdening their team. So hopefully there's a lot that someone can glean from these particular questions and answer them for themselves.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the same. down like 100 grand.